One evening, Daniel's world shattered when his girlfriend, Sophie, casually admitted she'd cheated on him. With a smirk, she declared she needed a real man, someone decisive, ambitious, not like Daniel, who she mocked for spending his weekends gaming with friends. Her words stung, but what hit harder was the reaction of his closest friends, Matt and Lily. They took Sophie's side, telling him not to overreact, that she deserved someone more put together. Instead of arguing, Daniel just smiled, a calm, almost eerie smile, grabbed his car keys and walked out of the apartment. The next morning, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 32 missed calls stared back at him, mostly from Sophie, a few from Matt and Lily, and some from numbers he didn't recognize. Sitting in his car, he started piecing it together. The signs had been there, scattered like breadcrumbs over the last few months of their 3-year relationship. Sophie staying late at work, a new perfume he didn't know, clothes he'd never seen popping up in their closet, and her phone suddenly becoming this untouchable thing always within arm's reach. Daniel wasn't the jealous type, never had been, but something had felt off. He'd told himself that after 3 years, he owed her the benefit of the doubt. Now, with the truth laid bare, he realized he'd been weaving a blindfold for himself all along. After leaving, Daniel checked into a small motel on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, and the owner, an older guy named George, seemed decent. When Daniel shared a bit of his story, George even knocked $20 off the weekly rate. 2 days later, Daniel turned his phone back on. The screen lit up with 32 missed calls and 47 texts, mostly from Sophie, some from Matt and Lily, and a handful from unknowns. But what really caught his eye was the flood of social media notifications. Sophie had been busy. She'd turned herself into the victim on Instagram, posting stories claiming Daniel was a controlling, jealous boyfriend who tracked her every move. According to her, he'd emotionally manipulated her for years, cut her off from friends, and flipped out when she finally stood up for herself. Each post racked up hundreds of sympathetic comments, including from people Daniel thought were his friends. The kicker was a tearful video where she accused him of financial abuse for making her split bills 50-50 while he hoarded his cash. Ironic, considering she earned more and had insisted on that setup herself. The storm didn't stay online. One morning, Daniel got a text from Emma, a longtime co-worker. "Check your work email." Sure enough, there was a company-wide message about fostering a safe workplace, with a vague nod to recent concerning behavior from certain employees. No names, but the timing wasn't subtle. Daniel's reputation was under fire from all sides. He could have been mad, could have fought back, but instead he just felt curious. How far would Sophie take this? At a local coffee shop he thought was safe, Sophie hated their coffee. He got a cold stare from the barista who'd always been friendly. Turns out Sophie had made it her new stage, sharing her survivor story with anyone who'd listen. Then a glimmer of hope. While grabbing clothes from storage, he ran into Clara, Sophie's supposed best friend. She looked nervous, glancing around like she was scared to be seen. "You need to watch out," she whispered. "Tom's not just her boss. His wife's connected, seriously connected. Sophie's telling her you're unstable, even dangerous." Daniel frowned. "Why tell me this?" Clara hesitated. "Because this isn't the first time. Before you, they did the same thing to another guy at work. He left town." Clara's warning stuck with Daniel. That night, he dug into social media and public records, uncovering a name. Ryan, a former co-worker who'd vanished from online life around the time Sophie started at the company. Things were clicking into place, but the story wasn't over. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar Instagram account. The profile pic showed an elegant woman in her 40s, dripping in expensive jewelry. The note was short. "We need to talk about my husband and your girlfriend. Coffee tomorrow. Mrs. T. Tom's wife." Daniel showed up to the meeting with a mix of doubt and hope. Mrs. T, sharp, composed with a steely gaze, didn't beat around the bush. She'd been tracking Tom and Sophie for months. Not just the affair, but a darker pattern. Before Daniel, there'd been at least one other victim, Ryan, whose reputation they'd teamed up to ruin and push out of the company. "They're pros at this," Mrs. T said, setting her coffee down. "But this time, I'm done letting it slide." She wanted Daniel to help expose them, though he wasn't sure how far he'd wade into this mess. Meanwhile, Sophie kept swinging. Daniel got a call from their landlord, who said she'd tried to remove his name from the lease, claiming he'd abandoned the place. When that flopped, she told the landlord he'd threatened her, prompting a concerned heads-up call. Luckily, the guy sympathized. His sister had been through something similar. Then came the real surprise, another message from Mrs. T's account. "Coffee tomorrow, 10 a.m. I've got something you need to see." At the cafe the next day, Mrs. T slid a stack of papers across the table. Texts, emails, even security footage from the company parking garage, all documenting Tom and Sophie's secret meetups. "My husband promised her the world," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I've got something stronger, proof." She pitched a bigger plan. Go public at the upcoming company party. When Daniel asked why him, Mrs. T gave a thin smile. "Because you didn't run like the others. I need someone brave enough to stand there when it all falls apart." He didn't answer right away, but a thought took root. Maybe this wasn't just about payback, it was about ending the nightmare. Daniel had no intention of going to the annual company party. Why throw himself to the wolves? But Mrs. T changed his mind with a simple line. "Sometimes the best revenge is letting them show who they really are." So he showed up at the downtown hotel, dressed sharper than ever. The room froze when he walked in. Sophie nearly dropped her drink, and Tom's face went from red to ghost white so fast Daniel thought he might pass out. The tension was electric, but Daniel didn't have to do much. Lily, half drunk, broke the silence first. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she slurred, loud enough for nearby groups to hear. "After everything you put Sophie through?" Daniel just smiled. "Everything I put her through? Tell me more." Right then, Emma, his trusty co-worker, stepped up. "I think we'd all like the real story," she said, holding up her phone. She'd quietly gathered evidence, screenshots of Sophie bragging about her conquests in company chats, recordings of her plotting with Tom to twist the narrative. Before anyone could process it, Mrs. T walked in, tablet in hand. As if by perfect accident, the room's projector flicked on, flashing texts and photos of Tom and Sophie, promises, schemes, the works. Sophie tried to play it cool, but panic crept in. She snapped at Daniel. "You think you're so smart. You and that bitter old hag are trying to ruin everything I've built. Tom loves me. We're going to have a life together." Mrs. T calmly set a stack of papers on the table, divorce papers, already filed with her signature. Tom wasn't just losing his wife, he was losing the fairy tale he'd sold Sophie. The climax hit when Matt, the bros before everything guy, accidentally sealed the deal. He'd been filming the whole thing, planning to show Tom later to score points. Instead, he caught Sophie's full meltdown on camera, screaming and sobbing in front of everyone. Clara, silent all night, finally spoke up. "I helped her," she admitted, her voice shaking as the room went quiet. "I helped her ruin someone else's reputation before. I can't do it again." By midnight, the party was dead. Sophie stormed out, mascara streaking her face, while Tom locked himself in his office with HR. Matt and Lily couldn't meet Daniel's eyes as he left. At the exit, Mrs. T grabbed his arm. "Thank you," she said, "for being the one who didn't run." Driving back to the motel, Daniel felt an odd peace. George, still up watching late-night TV in the office, looked at his face and grinned. "Good night, huh?" Daniel nodded. "You could say that." The company party's aftermath hit hard. Within 48 hours, Tom and Sophie were both asked to resign, but that was just the start. Mrs. T didn't stop with the party reveal. She handed the board a mountain of evidence. Fake expense reports Tom used to cover dinners with Sophie, emails plotting against co-workers, manipulated performance reviews. The company's legal team moved fast, less worried about the affair than the pattern of workplace harassment and financial misconduct. Tom and Sophie were now staring down civil lawsuits. Then Ryan, the guy who'd left town, came back. He brought receipts, literal and figurative, detailed records of the smear campaign Sophie and Tom ran against him. With Mrs. T's lawyer in tow, he filed his own suit. Then something beautiful happened. Other ex-employees stepped forward with their own stories and proof. One scandal snowballed into an avalanche. Sophie tried to get ahead of it, posting a teary video claiming she was the real victim, manipulated by Tom and now persecuted. But Clara, finally finding her backbone, dropped their private chats. Sophie gloating about her wins and mocking her targets. A week later, Sophie showed up at Daniel's motel. George called him at work. "That girl you told me about is causing a scene in the parking lot." Daniel took his time driving back. There she was, sitting on his car hood, mascara smeared, clutching a thick envelope. "I've got dirt on everyone," she said, her voice shaky but threatening. "If you don't help me stop this, I'll let it all out." Daniel laughed. "Go ahead. Burn every bridge you've got left. See how that works out." She threw the envelope at him. Photos, texts, years of leverage she'd hoarded. He snapped pics of every page while she watched, then handed it back. "Release whatever you want, but first, look where your last schemes got you." Sophie ripped it up right there, screaming they'd all regret it. Someone filmed it, and within hours, it was all over social media. The final blow landed yesterday. Mrs. T's divorce was finalized. She got everything: the house, the cars, most of their assets. Tom's golden parachute from the company vanished into legal fees. His reputation trashed beyond repair. Sophie slunk back to her parents' place in another state, her social media gone dark. Matt sent a long apology text about being a better friend, but Daniel just replied with a screenshot of Matt's old pro-Sophie messages. Matt blocked him. Lily's scrambling too, worried Sophie's stash might tank her own career. As for Daniel, he just signed a lease on a new apartment, landed a promotion at work, and started seeing someone new, taking it slow, doing it right. He learned revenge isn't about plotting or scheming. Sometimes it's just living well and letting others torch themselves. Still, he won't lie. Watching it all burn was pretty damn satisfying. Through George, he thanked the strangers who'd followed his story. Remember, he thought, closing this chapter, karma doesn't need your help. Sometimes you just step back and let people show who they really are.